Dawn rose lazily over the Pacific Ocean, as if it itself didn't want to disturb the massive bulk of the aircraft carrier USS Nimitz. But the flight deck was already alive with its noisy life. The roar of warming engines, metallic clangs, short commands, sharp gestures, all of it blending into a single hum that sounded like the breathing of a gigantic mechanical beast. Flight Deck Team Commander Elias Monroe stood at the starboard side, watching the colorful jerseys fill the space. Purples dragged heavy fuel hoses to the aircraft. Reds prepared ordnance. Greens vanished beneath the wings of F-18s, as if tinkering with the innards of living steel monsters. Blues carefully maneuvered the tow tractors, while whites, like sentries, walked around, peering at every gesture, every clumsy movement. Monroe saw these people as parts of a vast, complex machine, and he was responsible for making sure that machine ran without a hitch, and also that every one of them stayed alive. The responsibility weighed on him, sometimes heavier than the wind over the ocean. He hadn't liked this morning from the very start. Something about the deck sounded wrong. The steel plates seemed to vibrate a little harsher than usual, and the rhythm of the machines felt off by fractions of a second. Experience told Monroe that such little things often meant trouble. "Commander," Cory Banks called timidly. Cory stood a little behind him, clutching a toolbox to his chest. Just 1 month on the deck, and he'd already seen more danger than most people do in a lifetime. Yet his eyes were still too inexperienced, too bright for this place. "Stay behind the line and don't look toward the flame," Monroe said, stepping closer. "Scan the whole area, always. Your head has to work faster than your feet." Cory nodded, but his gaze still flickered and drifted back to the bright engine exhaust. Monroe sighed. Only a rookie looks that way once. If he's lucky, he lives. If not... The sound of a tow tractor made him turn. Mark Grom Hanley was confidently driving the machine, rolling another F-18 closer to the launch line. Mark was the kind who could work blind. Years of experience had replaced instinct for him. But it was exactly those kinds of guys who most often got into trouble. Overconfidence was the worst enemy on the deck. "Mark, keep your distance. It's slippery there," Monroe shouted. Grom didn't turn around, just raised a hand to show he'd heard. Monroe pressed his lips together. Hanley's confidence sometimes looked a lot like stubbornness, and the deck didn't like stubbornness. The engine start siren blared suddenly, deafening everyone. The first aircraft was ready for launch. Vibration rolled under their feet, as if the ship itself had drawn a breath and held it. For a second, Monroe closed his eyes. That sound always gave him the same feeling, like an abyss was opening beneath the deck, and someone had to be the first to step into it. Today's siren wail seemed louder than usual, sharper. Warning. Monroe wasn't a superstitious man, but years of service had taught him to listen to what others called intuition. The deck knew how to speak, and today it was whispering to him that the day would be bad. He exhaled, squared his shoulders, and looked at his people again. The colorful figures moved precisely, quickly, but he could see some of them were already tired, even though the shift had only just begun. I have to keep them in hand, Monroe thought, especially today. The wind picked up, the sky began to cloud over. The roar of the turbines grew closer, and with it came that feeling known only to flight deck crews, the start of a journey where every step could be the last. And behind Elias's back, Cory's childish, frightened voice still trembled. "Commander, what if I do something wrong?" Monroe looked at him for a long time, carefully. "Then I'll fix it, but you have to listen. To the deck, to me, to yourself. If you stop listening to even one of those things, she'll kill you." Cory nodded and swallowed hard, and Monroe knew the kid had heard him. The siren howled again. The first aircraft rolled toward the catapult, and the day stepped into its full power. The second aircraft was preparing for launch when the sky over the ocean finally closed in with heavy clouds, and a cold, hard shadow fell across the deck, where life still boiled with the same merciless intensity. Every sound, from the sharp metallic screech to the deep guttural roar of the engines, merged into a single vibration that crawled up the spine of everyone who stepped onto these 4.5 acres of steel, whose edges began exactly where human certainty ended, and just a little farther, fear began.
That fear never truly vanished. It only hid beneath layers of experience and habit, waiting to return at the worst possible moment. Cory Banks tried to walk confidently, but his legs still threatened to fall out of rhythm. The wind slapped salty ocean spray into his face, and the howling turbines of the FA-18 turned the world's sounds into a chaotic echo where he couldn't distinguish his own breathing or even his own thoughts. Only the sharp gestures of the yellow jerseys, crisp as a drill sergeant's commands, kept him inside the invisible logic of flight deck operations, where every hand signal meant far more than any spoken word. "Stay close to me," Monroe shouted, leaning right into his ear because otherwise his voice would dissolve in the roar of the machines. "And keep your head up. Look ahead, not at your feet." Cory obediently lifted his chin and tried to scan the space in front of him, but all he saw was chaos. The flicker of colored jerseys, heavy wings rising and falling in the gusts, and the howling turbines of the FA-18 turned the world's sounds into a chaotic echo, where he couldn't distinguish his own breathing, or even his own thoughts. Only the sharp gestures of the yellow jerseys, crisp as a drill sergeant's commands, kept him inside the invisible logic of flight deck operations, where every hand signal meant far more than any spoken word. Cory obediently lifted his chin and tried to scan the space in front of him, but all he saw was chaos. The flicker of colored jerseys, heavy wings rising and falling in the gusts, and mechanics sprinting across the deck as if they didn't notice death walking beside them. They worked inches away from moving aircraft, from exhaust jets hot enough to hurl a man overboard, from propellers spinning so fast that they looked like blurred gray discs instead of blades. Grom Hanley, as usual, stood calm. He leaned casually against the wing of an aircraft beside his tow tractor, seeming to hold the whole situation together with a single glance. Though at that very moment a gust rose along the edge so strong that two sailors nearly lost their footing. Only a quickly thrown line kept them aboard, and the sight sent a familiar, searing jolt of alarm through Monroe. Every tiny incident reminded him how razor-thin the distance was here between life and death, between a job done and a catastrophe later recorded in reports as dry, impersonal lines. Monroe glanced at the sky. The clouds kept thickening, as if something were leaning over the ship, pushing it toward the inevitable, and he felt that strange, familiar pressure beneath his ribs that always came before events that turned into tragedies. It felt as though the deck itself had tensed, listening to the footsteps of the crew, the roar of engines, the wind trying to wrench the carrier off balance. At that instant, a shout rang out from the left, short, sharp, indistinct, but carrying something that made Monroe spin around instantly. Cory, seeing his commander's face change in a flash, nearly froze. He understood something had happened. A yellow jersey near the third aircraft waved both arms toward the deck mechanics, a sharp, commanding gesture demanding instant reaction. One of the greens working beneath the wing jerked backward just as a tiny, almost invisible flame flared under the fuselage, barely bright enough to blink and miss, but enough to make Monroe's heart plummet. "Fuel, clear back," he roared, though he knew he was shouting into the void. No one could hear him in this hell of noise. But his hand signals were clear, understood by everyone. The mechanics leapt back, green jerseys scattered through the section like a swarm of startled bees. I saw Grom slam the external fuel valve shut with one decisive motion, moving so fast and sure as if it had been born for exactly this moment. The flame died as suddenly as it had appeared, leaving behind the smell of superheated metal and the sharp, choking aftertaste of danger. Cory stood pale, as though that brief second had torn a piece of his soul away. Monroe walked over and touched his shoulder, forcing him to breathe deeper. "You need to remember one thing," he said, looking straight into the rookie's wide eyes. "On this deck, danger doesn't come with a warning. It doesn't shout, doesn't give you time to think. It just happens. And our job is to be faster than it is." Cory nodded, but his voice cracked. I thought he was going to burn." "We've all thought that at some point. And we still keep working." The wind grew stronger still, diving beneath the wings, rocking the aircraft as if giant predatory birds were trying to break free of their mechanical chains. The deck beneath their feet gave the faintest shudder, so subtle only someone who had lived on it for years could feel it. Monroe felt it.
And he understood everything up to now had only been the warning. The real test was still ahead.
By the time the third aircraft was towed to the catapults and the yellow jersey raised both arms, signaling ready to launch, the air over the deck had grown so thick with tension you could almost reach out and push it aside like heavy cloth just to find a clear thought. The kind of clarity you need in a place where every chakra of human attention is stretched to its limit and the brain is juggling dozens of variables at once. Wind direction, the unpredictability of a human step, the vibration underfoot, the engine screaming as if the devil himself were spinning its blades. All of it fused into a state Monroe had long ago learned to recognize. The instant when the deck seems to freeze for a fraction of a second before something changes forever. Cory Banks stood a little behind him, clutching the toolbox so hard it might as well have been a shield. Yet for the first time, a spark of confidence flickered in his eyes, as if the recent scare, against all odds, had unlocked a resource most people here only find through pain. He was trying to mimic the mechanic's movements, scanning around him, stepping in rhythm with the deck, but he was still making the small mistakes veterans spot instantly. Head turning too sharply, eyes lingering too long on one thing, reactions half a beat slow. Monroe noticed every one of them but didn't show it. Everyone here has to go through the clumsy stage, and you have to let them grow without letting them die. Grom Hanley was checking the tie-downs on the fourth jet, throwing Monroe quick, almost invisible glances that said, "I've got it, boss, don't worry." And that really did calm him, because Mark didn't just have years on the deck, he felt it as keenly as Monroe did, sometimes more keenly. Men like him were the ones who could keep chaos from winning when the machines decided to turn against the humans. Yet, something had shifted, so subtly that even Monroe didn't catch the source of the thin, stinging jab of unease at first. Maybe it was the wind suddenly gusting harder. Maybe the hull's vibration coming up through the soles of his boots a shade sharper than a minute ago. Or maybe it was the yellow jersey freezing half a second longer than usual while checking some microscopic detail of the aircraft's position. That tiny hesitation was the signal to a trained eye that something in the choreography needed attention. Monroe stepped closer, trying to see what had caused the pause, and out of the corner of his eye he caught two blues wrestling with the tow tractor that had started acting strange. The engine coughed, the frame jerked, and the vehicle lurched sideways instead of rolling straight, forcing Cory to take an instinctive step back. And then everything happened at once, as it always does on the deck, where tragedy doesn't creep in gradually, it slams down in one tight, tearing blow. The tractor jerked again, harder. The rear wheels lost traction on the wet steel. One of the blues tried to correct but grabbed the wrong part too late. At the exact same instant, a gust whipping in from the ocean slammed into the wing of the FA-18, and the jet shuddered like it had come alive. 3 micro-events lined up into what the investigators would later call the perfect storm. Monroe saw the wing begin to swing. He felt the deck's rhythm change beneath his feet. He knew the chain was about to break loose, and he lunged forward to snap it. But in that same heartbeat, Cory, not seeing the whole picture, took one step, one single step, just a couple of inches into the path of the skidding tractor, now a mindless steel beast ready to crush anything in its way. Monroe screamed louder than he ever had in his life, but the engine swallowed the sound whole. Only Grom heard, not the words, but the raw essence of the shout, the wordless command, danger, that needs no language. Grom hurled himself forward, tackling Cory like he was ripping him out of the jaws of the machine. But at that instant, the tractor clipped the FA-18's wing. The impact rang out with a deep, horrifying thud that Monroe would hear in his sleep for months afterward. The echo of a catastrophe that didn't quite happen, yet somehow still did, only in a different shape. Cory hit the deck, knocked clear by Grom. The tractor, completely out of control, whipped its tail toward the open edge. Monroe sprinted after Hanley because he understood. Now Mark was the one in the path of destruction. And the seconds stretched like taffy, and the air turned to syrup, and fear became reality. Because Mark was sliding straight toward the edge.
Mark Grom Hanley, the man who had snatched dozens of others from the jaws of deck death and seemed himself untouchable, was sliding across the wet steel toward the edge so fast that even the wind seemed to flinch, unable to keep up. Monroe, lunging after him on pure instinct,
understood with some deep sixth sense that this wasn't just one man's fate hanging in the balance. It was the fragile equilibrium of the entire team. If Mark went over, it wouldn't just be a body lost. It would be the certainty that the deck could be tamed by human skill, that chaos could be caged if you knew its language well enough. All of it would fall with him. Cory, still sprawled on the deck, hadn't yet grasped what was happening. He saw only flashes of motion, torn shadows, Mark's silhouette hurtling toward the void, and Monroe moving not in steps, but in desperate animal lunges, as if he believed sheer will could defy physics. But the deck was merciless, steel slick as ice, wind ripping at clothes, every meter a wrestling match with a living element that wanted to keep its prey. The instant Mark reached the edge, everything went strangely quiet. Not in reality. The engine still thundered, the jet still howled, the signals still flew. But inside that heartbeat, there opened a pause, the gap between seconds where life and death decisions live. Even Monroe, hardened by years, felt something inside him drop away, as though he were standing not on the flight deck, but on the brink of his own existence. Mark clawed for purchase, but his gloves slid uselessly across the metal. His boots kicked at empty air, finding nothing. Below, the ocean opened its black maw, ready to swallow anyone who fell, because the sea doesn't care whether you were a seasoned veteran or a terrified rookie, hero or screw-up. It takes everyone the same. Monroe dove forward, arm extended so violently something cracked in his shoulder. Pain didn't matter. Only one thing did. Reach Mark before the wind tore him away. In that moment, time stopped behaving like ordinary time. A fraction of a second stretched into eternity, filled with nothing but the desperate effort to stretch a few more inches. And he reached him. Monroe's fingers clamped around Hanley's gear belt. The yank he gave felt strong enough to shift the entire carrier, but Mark was heavy, and the weight of his falling body multiplied by momentum became unbearable. Monroe's boots started sliding, his knees buckling. The pull dragged him toward the edge too, slow and relentless, as if death had decided one wasn't enough and wanted both. Cory saw it, saw the unbreakable commander losing ground inch by inch, and something inside the kid snapped into place. The kind of snap that only happens when there's no choice left. Move now or lose everything forever. He surged forward, clumsy, heavy, but powered by the strength that comes when fear is forgotten. He threw himself at Monroe, grabbed the commander's belt, dug his boots into the deck's steel ribs and hauled with everything he had, knowing full well that he was the weakest link, that his weight was nothing against two grown men sliding toward the abyss. But he held, he clung, he refused to let go. Mark felt the fall stop. With a last desperate surge, he pulled himself upward. At that exact second, the wind, which should have finished him, betrayed death and struck from below instead, slamming his body against the edge. Monroe gained the precious inches he needed. Then, everything happened at once. Mark found purchase with one foot, pushed, and all three men, Monroe, Hanley, and Cory, collapsed onto the deck in a tangled, gasping heap, like fish flung ashore by a wave, breathing as if every lungful had to be fought for. Yellow jerseys were already sprinting toward them, waving frantic clear the area signals because the deck waits for no one. But the three men lying on the steel heard only their own hammering hearts and the knowledge that everything, literally everything, could have ended differently. Monroe rose first, swaying like a man waking from a nightmare in which he'd seen his own death. Grom sat up beside him, wiping sweat from his brow, and said quietly, "Thanks, boss." Monroe looked at him with a tired, almost bitter smile. "Don't thank me. Just, today wasn't your day." Then he turned to Cory, and in his eyes was recognition. "You held. You saved us both." Cory opened his mouth, but no sound came, only a shaky nod. Behind them, the ocean kept slamming against the hull, as if reminding them, this isn't over. It never is.
When the alarm had finally died away and flight deck operations slipped back into their relentless, machine-precise rhythm, like a vast living organism that cannot afford to pause for a single second, a single breath, a single tremor in a hand, Monroe stood on the center line of the taxiway and watched his crew slowly settle back into the familiar flow. Yet every one of them, from yellow jersey to purple, had seen how the world, this narrow world of 4.5 acres, had teetered beneath their feet today, opening the maw usually keeps hidden from inexperienced eyes. Now he could see it in their movements, that razor-edged sharpness that only comes after you stare death down, a sharpness laced with stubborn, furious will to live, to work, to keep themselves and everything around them under control,
as if that were the only way to remind the deck that human beings still matter here. Cory stood a little apart, fingers curled tight, shaking not from fear now, but from the flood of adrenaline still coursing through him. Inside his chest, everything hammered, as if his heart were trying to claw its way out. Yet he didn't step 1 inch away from the line where Monroe had placed him. He stood with the same childlike straight-back posture he'd had on his first day, but something deeper had appeared in his eyes, the kind of depth that is only born when you've brushed against the real price of living. Mark Hanley was already back on his feet, though his stride betrayed the bruises the deck had left on him. Grom, scowling and silent as always after close calls, worked with a concentration that felt like a dare. The deck would not take him, not today, not ever, because he never gave ground. That inner iron was what had always kept him balanced on the knife edge between disaster and salvation. But Monroe knew none of them. Mark Cory himself would come out of this the same. Every time the deck steals a second, a breath, a near fall, it also steals a piece of the person, forcing him to become either stronger or hollower, and sometimes, in the rarest cases, both at once. He walked a few steps toward the edge, to the place where, only a minute ago, the air had been stretched like a wire and the steel had been the boundary between life and the black water below. He looked down. The ocean churned, thick and dark and hostile. The waves breaking against the hull looked like claws of something patient, waiting for the next misstep. The wind hit his face, carrying more than salt spray. It carried memory. Memory of those who had fallen, those no one had caught in time, whose names ended up on small metal plaques in quiet rooms nobody brags about, but which are always kept where only their own kind can see them. Monroe let out a slow breath because he understood. Today was already written on those walls. Whatever happened next, the deck had marked every man who survived, every man who held another back from the void, every man who had almost gone over. He walked back to the team. The yellow jersey in charge of the section raised a hand in confirmation. The next FA-18 was ready. Life went on, no matter what had just happened. The deck demanded attention, focus, split-second decisions again and again, leaving no room for feelings. Monroe raised his own hand, giving permission to resume. The jet began rolling toward the catapult, engines screaming so loud that words became meaningless. Everything turned back into vibration, rhythm, hand signals. Only the eyes of the crew remained the only way to read what was going on inside each man. Cory, standing beside him, watched the aircraft thunder away with a different expression now. Not fear, not wide-eyed wonder, but respect laced with the hard-won knowledge of what every launch, every step, every heartbeat on this deck actually cost.
"Commander," he began quietly, uncertain, as if afraid to disturb the rhythm. Monroe turned toward him, still keeping half an eye on the launch line. "Yeah, Cory?" The kid had to swallow hard. "I thought someday I'd get used to it, that I'd end up, well, like you, or like Mark. But now I get it. You can't ever get used to it. Maybe that's how it's supposed to be." Monroe studied him for a long moment. In Cory's words was not just a young man trying to make sense of the world, but a kernel of truth every one of them, himself included, had once tried to swallow and found it stuck in the throat. "You never get used to it," he said at last, "because the day you do, the deck takes you. Fear isn't the enemy. Fear keeps you alive. Carelessness, that's what kills." Cory nodded, and in that nod there was something heavier, something adult. The catapult fired with a roar that tore the air apart, and the jet shot forward and vanished into the gray sky, leaving only a ribbon of steam behind. Mark walked up, still scowling, but very much alive. "So, boss," he growled, as if picking up a conversation that had started right at the edge of the abyss, "tell the deck we beat her today." Monroe, for the first time all day, let a short, almost invisible smile cross his face. "Today, yeah. Tomorrow, we'll see." The wind hit them again, carrying salt, steel, and something indefinable, the scent of people who keep standing in a place where one step wrong can be the last. But they stood, because the deck doesn't wait for the brave. It makes them. And today, it had made one more.